Some movies entertain you. Some frighten you. And then there are the movies that make you question why you pressed play in the first place. These are films that crossed boundaries, challenged censors, shocked audiences, divided critics, and sometimes became more famous because people were told they should never watch them. Tonight, we are entering cinema's darkest territory, where violence becomes unforgettable, disturbing ideas refuse to disappear, and filmmakers deliberately push audiences beyond their comfort zones. From psychological nightmares and brutal horror to controversial masterpieces that caused outrage, these 15 films prove that the most shocking movies are often the ones that stay inside your head long after the screen goes black. The Substance, 2024. Imagine being offered the chance to become a younger, more beautiful, more perfect version of yourself, with one condition. You have to share your body with that version of you. That nightmare becomes the foundation of Coralie Fargeet's The Substance, a film that begins like a glossy Hollywood fantasy and gradually mutates into one of the most outrageous body horror experiences of recent cinema. At the center is Elizabeth Sparkle, played by Demi Moore, a celebrated television personality whose career begins collapsing when she is considered too old for the entertainment industry. Instead of accepting her fading fame, Elizabeth discovers a mysterious product known simply as The Substance. It promises a younger, improved version of herself, and when she takes the leap, Sue is born, played by Margaret Qualley. At first, the arrangement seems almost magical. Elizabeth and Sue are technically the same person, separated into two bodies, and they are supposed to alternate existence according to strict rules. But Sue quickly becomes addicted to her new identity. She enjoys the attention, the youth, the beauty, and the power that Elizabeth has been losing. What begins as a strange science fiction experiment becomes a vicious battle between two versions of the same woman. The movie's horror isn't simply about blood or grotesque transformations. Its real target is society's obsession with youth, beauty, celebrity, and the idea that a woman's value decreases with age. Demi Moore's performance is central to the film's impact because Elizabeth isn't presented as a monster. She is vulnerable, frightened, ambitious, and desperately afraid of becoming invisible. That makes the transformation increasingly tragic. The film deliberately turns beauty into something horrifying. Perfect skin, perfect bodies, television smiles, glamorous costumes, and celebrity culture are transformed into images of decay and physical excess. The contrast is what makes the movie so effective. It begins with the visual language of a luxury advertisement and slowly destroys that fantasy from the inside. And then the film starts escalating. What seemed shocking 10 minutes earlier becomes almost normal compared with what follows. Fargeet uses practical-looking body horror, exaggerated imagery, disturbing transformations, and deliberately excessive visual effects to create a cinematic experience that feels almost impossible to forget. The film isn't trying to quietly disturb you. It wants you to stare at the screen and confront the ugliness underneath an industry obsessed with perfection. The most fascinating part is that The Substance works simultaneously as horror, satire, science fiction, and a brutal commentary on Hollywood. The central question isn't simply whether Elizabeth can survive the substance. It's whether she can ever accept herself without becoming someone else. The film takes that idea and pushes it to an outrageous extreme, creating a finale that feels less like a conventional horror ending and more like a visual explosion of everything the story has been building toward. By the time the credits arrive, the movie has transformed from a story about a mysterious drug into something much bigger. It is a nightmare about aging, fame, identity, and self-hatred. And that is exactly why The Substance became so difficult to forget. It doesn't simply show you something disturbing. It asks why audiences are so fascinated by perfection in the first place. Barbarian, 2022. Few modern horror movies understand the value of keeping an audience completely confused as well as Barbarian. The story begins with a simple situation. A woman arrives at a rental house late at night and discovers that someone else is already staying there. That person is Keith. And immediately, the audience has questions. Is Keith dangerous? Is Tess in danger? Was the house double booked? Should she leave? The movie deliberately plays with the viewer's assumptions, making you think you understand the situation before suddenly changing the entire story. The house contains a hidden secret, and once Tess discovers it, Barbarian becomes something completely different. One of the film's greatest strengths is its ability to manipulate expectations. It starts like a psychological thriller, shifts into horror, introduces unexpected humor, and eventually becomes a disturbing exploration of abuse, manipulation, and generational trauma. The underground passages beneath the house are particularly terrifying because they suggest that the building itself has been designed around something hidden. Tess enters deeper into the darkness, and the audience gradually learns that the danger is far stranger than expected. The film also makes an unusual choice by giving us multiple perspectives. Just when you become comfortable with one character, the story changes direction and forces you to rethink everything. The creature at the center of the story is disturbing, but the film's real horror is human behavior. The movie repeatedly shows how people manipulate, exploit, and dismiss one another. Some characters create danger through cruelty, others through arrogance, and others simply because they refuse to believe what they are seeing. The result is a horror movie where the monster is only part of the problem. There are several violent moments, but what makes them effective is the unpredictability. The audience never knows exactly what kind of movie they are watching. A scene can begin as comedy and end in horror. The character who seems important can suddenly disappear. A seemingly safe room can become a trap. And then the movie reveals why the house exists the way it does. That revelation turns the entire story into something darker. What looked like a strange rental house mystery becomes a story about cycles of abuse and the terrible things people can hide behind ordinary walls. Barbarian is shocking not because it constantly shows gore, but because it keeps surprising you. And when the final pieces fall into place, the house no longer feels like a location. It feels like a physical representation of everything the characters are trying to escape. Evil Dead Rise, 2023. The Evil Dead franchise has never been interested in making audiences comfortable, but Evil Dead Rise takes the series into a cramped apartment building and proves that you don't need a remote cabin to create absolute chaos. The story begins with a family whose ordinary life is shattered when an ancient evil is unleashed. Beth visits her sister Ellie, only to discover that something has gone terribly wrong. When the supernatural force takes control, the apartment becomes a prison. What makes the movie frightening is the limited environment. There is nowhere to run. Hallways become traps. Elevators become terrifying. Doors become barriers. And every room can suddenly become the location of something horrifying. Director Lee Cronin understands that modern horror audiences expect bigger and bloodier set pieces, and the film delivers them. Evil Dead Rise contains an enormous amount of practical-looking gore, brutal violence, and grotesque transformations. But the violence works because it is constantly tied to the emotional relationship between family members. Ellie isn't just another victim. She is a mother. Her children are trapped with her. That creates a particularly cruel horror scenario because the characters aren't fighting strangers. They are watching someone they love become something else. The movie also preserves the dark humor that has always been part of the franchise. Some moments are so outrageously violent that the audience almost has to laugh because the alternative is simply staring in disbelief. The basement discovery is the turning point. Once the ancient book is found, the film becomes a relentless descent into supernatural madness. The characters try to understand what is happening, but every attempt to regain control only makes the situation worse. The apartment building itself becomes increasingly claustrophobic. The outside world feels unreachable. The family is isolated, and the evil presence seems to grow stronger with every passing minute. What makes Evil Dead Rise especially memorable is its willingness to combine family horror with extreme splatter. It doesn't simply ask whether the characters will survive. It asks what happens when survival requires confronting someone you love. By the final act, the movie has abandoned almost every remaining restraint. Blood floods the screen, bodies are destroyed, and the supernatural horror becomes a full-scale nightmare. Yet beneath all the chaos is a surprisingly simple idea. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't an ancient demon. It's the possibility that the person standing in front of you may no longer be the person you know. American Psycho, 2000. Christian Bale's performance as Patrick Bateman became one of the most recognizable portraits of psychological horror in modern cinema. Bateman appears to have everything: money, status, designer clothing, a luxury apartment, expensive restaurants, a prestigious career on Wall Street. But underneath the perfect exterior is something deeply disturbing. He is obsessed with status, appearance, and competition. His entire world is built around showing other people that he has more money, better clothes, better reservations, and greater social importance. Then the violence begins. Mary Harron's adaptation of Bret Easton Ellis's controversial novel uses horror as satire. Bateman's brutality is shocking, but the movie's real target is the culture surrounding him. His colleagues barely listen to each other. They confuse one another's identities. They obsess over business cards. They discuss restaurants as though choosing the right table is a life-or-death matter. Bateman's increasingly disturbing behavior exists inside a world that seems strangely indifferent. That is what makes the film so unsettling. Is Bateman actually committing everything we see? Or are some of these events fantasies inside his collapsing mind? The movie deliberately refuses to provide a simple answer. Christian Bale's performance is the key. He plays Bateman with an almost cartoonish perfection. His smile is controlled. His voice is calm. His movements are precise. And then suddenly, the mask disappears. The violence is often exaggerated and grotesque, but the satire remains the center of the story. Bateman is terrified of being ordinary. He has built an identity around things that can be purchased, displayed, or compared. But none of it gives him meaning. The famous business card sequence is almost funny until you realize what it represents. These men have constructed entire identities around superficial differences that are practically invisible. The movie became controversial because of its graphic violence and sexual material, but its deeper impact comes from the question it asks about identity. What happens when a society teaches people that appearance is everything? What happens when someone has everything they were told to want and still feels completely empty? American Psycho answers those questions with one of cinema's darkest characters. Hereditary, 2018. Some horror movies scare you while you're watching them. Hereditary follows you afterward. Ari Aster's film begins with the death of an elderly family matriarch. Her daughter Annie is grieving while trying to maintain a normal life with her husband and children. But the family soon experiences a series of increasingly disturbing events. At first, Annie believes grief is destroying her family. Then she begins to suspect that something much worse has been inherited. The title itself becomes increasingly meaningful. The film asks whether the darkness inside a family can be passed down like a physical trait. Annie struggles with her relationship with her children, especially Charlie, a strange and isolated girl whose behavior becomes increasingly unsettling. The film's horror is built around family tension. People argue. Secrets emerge. Old wounds reopen. Nobody knows how to communicate what they are experiencing. And then comes one of the movie's most shocking moments. Without describing the graphic details, it is enough to say that the scene involving Charlie completely changes the film. The horror suddenly becomes personal, immediate, and impossible to ignore. From that point onward, Annie's grief becomes almost unbearable. She begins searching for explanations, experimenting with supernatural practices, and trying desperately to understand what is happening to her family. But every answer leads to another horrifying discovery. Ari Aster directs the movie with extraordinary patience. The camera often remains still, allowing disturbing events to unfold without conventional horror editing. The house becomes almost like a miniature stage where every character is trapped. The film also uses tiny details to foreshadow what is coming. Objects, photographs, drawings, and conversations that initially seem meaningless become increasingly important. As the story approaches its conclusion, the family discovers that their suffering has been part of something much larger. The final act is deliberately terrifying because it confirms that the characters were never truly in control. Hereditary became controversial and unforgettable not because it constantly relies on gore, but because it combines supernatural horror with emotional devastation. It is a movie about inherited trauma, grief, and the horrifying possibility that sometimes your family history is not something you can escape. The Menu, 2022. At first glance, the menu looks like a sophisticated dinner party thriller. A wealthy group of guests travels to a remote island to experience an exclusive meal prepared by an internationally famous chef. But this isn't going to be an ordinary dinner. Ralph Fiennes plays Chef Julian Slowik, a perfectionist who treats cooking like religion. His restaurant is almost impossible to enter, and his guests have paid enormous amounts of money for an experience they believe will be unforgettable. They're right. Just not for the reason they expected. Margot, played by Anya Taylor-Joy, arrives with Tyler, played by Nicholas Hoult. Tyler is obsessed with food and the chef, but Margot immediately senses that something is wrong. The guests are divided into different categories: wealthy regulars, celebrities, critics, businessmen, and people connected to the restaurant's past. Slowly, the dinner becomes a performance. Each course tells a story, and each story becomes darker. The chef begins revealing secrets about his guests, humiliating them and forcing them to confront the reasons they are there. The movie uses food as a weapon. Instead of simply serving meals, Slowik uses each course to expose hypocrisy, greed, and entitlement. The horror comes from the realization that the guests are trapped. They cannot simply leave. The restaurant staff are completely devoted to the chef, and the dinner is following a plan. What makes the menu so effective is its mixture of horror and dark comedy. Some moments are genuinely disturbing, while others are so absurd that they become hilarious. But underneath the humor is a serious criticism of wealth and the modern culture of consumption. The wealthy guests believe that paying enormous amounts of money gives them access to something special. Slowik believes they have destroyed the meaning of what he loves. The restaurant's food has become a status symbol rather than an experience. The chef himself is also a victim. His passion for cooking has been crushed by the expectations of wealthy customers, critics, and the industry. The result is a revenge fantasy disguised as a gourmet dinner. And Margot becomes the one person who doesn't behave according to Slowik's expectations. She understands something the others don't. Sometimes the only way to survive a game designed by someone else is to stop playing by their rules. The final course delivers the movie's most memorable visual idea, transforming an elite dining experience into something almost childlike. And that contrast is exactly what makes the ending work. Eyes Wide Shut, 1999. Stanley Kubrick's final film is less about graphic violence and more about secrecy, desire, jealousy, and the terrifying realization that you may never truly know another person. Tom Cruise plays Dr. Bill Harford, a successful New York physician whose seemingly perfect marriage begins to unravel after his wife Alice reveals a private fantasy involving another man. That confession changes Bill. He becomes jealous and emotionally unsettled. He leaves home and begins wandering through New York during the night, entering increasingly strange situations. Eventually, he discovers a secret gathering involving wealthy and powerful people wearing masks. The sequence becomes one of the film's most mysterious images. The masks are important because they represent the difference between public identity and private desire. Everyone in the film seems to be playing a role. Nobody is completely honest about what they want. Bill's journey becomes increasingly dangerous because he is entering a world where he doesn't understand the rules. The movie's erotic atmosphere is deliberately unsettling, but its central subject isn't simply sexuality. It is insecurity. Bill believes his marriage is stable because he believes he understands his wife. Alice's confession destroys that certainty. Suddenly, he begins imagining possibilities he cannot control. Kubrick uses long takes, dreamlike lighting, and slow pacing to create a strange atmosphere in which New York feels almost unreal. The movie isn't moving toward a conventional thriller conclusion. It feels like a nightmare that keeps changing shape. Bill's obsession leads him toward secrets he probably should never have discovered. The masked gathering becomes the centerpiece of the film because it represents a hidden society where ordinary rules no longer seem to apply. And the more Bill investigates, the more dangerous his curiosity becomes. Eyes Wide Shut was controversial because of its sexual imagery and mysterious themes, but its lasting power comes from ambiguity. Is Bill dreaming? Is he uncovering a real conspiracy? Is his wife actually more honest about desire than he is? Or is the entire journey simply exposing the insecurities already inside him? Kubrick never gives the audience complete certainty. And perhaps that is the point. The most frightening secrets are not always the ones other people are hiding. Sometimes they are the truths we refuse to admit about ourselves. The Exorcist, 1973. There are horror movies that become popular. Then there are horror movies that permanently change the genre. The Exorcist is one of them. The story begins with a young girl named Regan and her mother Chris. At first, strange things happen inside their home. Regan behaves differently. Objects move. Her personality changes. Medical explanations fail to provide answers. Eventually, Chris becomes convinced that something supernatural has taken control of her daughter. The movie's power comes from its realism. Instead of presenting demonic possession as a fantasy adventure, director William Friedkin treats it like a horrifying medical and psychological crisis. Doctors examine Regan. Specialists investigate. Everyone searches for a rational explanation. Nothing works. The transformation of Regan becomes increasingly disturbing, and the film's combination of religious imagery, psychological terror, and physical horror shocked audiences when it was released. But the movie's greatest strength is actually the emotional relationship between Chris and Regan. Chris is a mother trying to save her child. That makes every supernatural event more horrifying because the stakes are not abstract. This is not simply a battle between good and evil. It is a mother watching her daughter disappear behind something she cannot understand. The film also introduces Father Damien Karras, a priest struggling with his own crisis of faith. His personal doubts become crucial because the story requires him to confront something that challenges his understanding of reality. The final confrontation becomes a battle involving faith, sacrifice, and love. The movie was controversial for its religious imagery, disturbing content, and intense atmosphere. Some viewers reported fainting, vomiting, or leaving theaters during screenings. Stories about strange incidents surrounding the film only increased its reputation. But its legacy isn't based solely on controversy. The Exorcist is carefully constructed filmmaking. The sound design, lighting, performances, and pacing create a sense of dread that still works decades later. The film understands that the most frightening question isn't whether demons exist. It's what you would do if you discovered that something truly evil had taken control of someone you love. A Clockwork Orange, 1971. Few movies have created as much controversy while simultaneously becoming recognized as a major work of cinema as Stanley Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange. The story follows Alex, a charismatic young man whose life revolves around violence, music, and domination. He leads a gang of friends through a dystopian society where crime and brutality have become part of everyday life. What makes Alex so disturbing is not simply what he does. It is the fact that he is intelligent, articulate, and fascinated by classical music. Kubrick creates an uncomfortable contrast between beauty and brutality. Elegant music accompanies violent imagery. Stylish production design surrounds horrifying behavior. The audience is repeatedly forced to confront the question of whether artistic beauty can coexist with extreme cruelty. Eventually, Alex is captured by the authorities and offered a controversial treatment designed to eliminate his violent impulses. The treatment works, or at least appears to. But the movie's real question begins there. If a person is forced to become good, are they actually good? Alex's treatment removes his ability to choose violence. But if morality requires free will, then has society truly made him better, or simply taken away part of what makes him human? This philosophical question is what elevates the movie beyond shock value. The violence caused enormous controversy, particularly because the film's stylish presentation could be interpreted as making brutality visually seductive. The movie also became associated with real-world crimes, adding another layer to its reputation. Kubrick himself later withdrew the film from circulation in the United Kingdom after intense controversy and media attention. Yet decades later, the film remains widely discussed because its central question has not disappeared. Can a government force people to behave morally? And if it can, should it? A Clockwork Orange remains disturbing because it refuses to give an easy answer. Alex is undeniably monstrous, but the methods used to control him are also deeply unsettling. The result is a film that challenges the viewer rather than simply shocking them. It is violent, provocative, strange, and deliberately uncomfortable. And that may be exactly why it has survived for more than half a century. The Night House, 2020. Not every disturbing movie needs mountains of blood. Sometimes the most terrifying thing is simply discovering that the person you loved may have been hiding an entire life from you. The Night House follows Beth, a woman grieving the sudden death of her husband. She lives alone in a beautiful lakeside house that her husband built for her. At first, the home seems peaceful. Then Beth starts hearing things. She sees strange shapes. She experiences nightmares. She discovers hidden objects belonging to her husband. And slowly, she begins to suspect that the man she thought she knew may have been keeping a terrible secret. The film uses grief as its central weapon. Beth isn't simply afraid of something supernatural. She is trying to understand why her husband died and what he was hiding before his death. As she investigates, the architecture of the house becomes increasingly important. The building appears to contain hidden spaces and strange patterns, creating an atmosphere where the viewer begins questioning what is real. The film's supernatural imagery is often subtle. Shadows seem to move where they shouldn't. Empty spaces appear occupied. Figures are visible for just long enough to make you question whether you actually saw them. That uncertainty is crucial. The movie doesn't immediately explain its mythology. Instead, it allows Beth and the audience to discover pieces of information at the same time. Every revelation creates another question. And the deeper Beth goes, the darker her husband's secret becomes. The story eventually explores themes of suicide, grief, trauma, and the fear of being alone. These aren't simply background elements. They determine how Beth interprets everything happening around her. The horror works because the supernatural threat becomes inseparable from her emotional state. By the final act, the film has revealed that the house is connected to something far more disturbing than Beth initially imagined. What seemed like a story about a grieving widow becomes a story about the possibility that something has been waiting for her all along. The Night House proves that disturbing cinema doesn't always need graphic violence. Sometimes an empty room, a dark window, and the suggestion that someone is standing behind you can be far more terrifying. Malignant, 2021. James Wan built his reputation on modern horror franchises, but Malignant proves that he wasn't interested in simply repeating himself. The movie begins with Madison, a woman suffering terrifying visions of brutal murders. The problem is that these murders aren't just nightmares. They are happening. And Madison appears to be connected to them. The movie initially feels like a supernatural detective story. Madison sees murders before they happen, and police struggle to understand how she could possibly know details that haven't been released. As the visions become more violent, Madison begins investigating her own past. Her childhood contains missing pieces. Her memories are incomplete. And something called Gabriel keeps appearing in her mind. The film's biggest strength is its willingness to embrace the ridiculous. Malignant begins with a relatively serious horror tone, but eventually becomes something far more extravagant. The final act turns into an almost operatic display of supernatural violence, martial arts choreography, and body horror. That tonal shift is exactly why the movie became so divisive. Some viewers expected a conventional horror thriller. Instead, one delivers something that feels like a supernatural slasher crossed with a comic book nightmare. Gabriel is one of the film's central mysteries. Madison slowly realizes that her connection to him is not what she thought. Her past, her body, and her memories are all connected in ways that fundamentally change how we understand the story. The movie's violence becomes increasingly stylized. Instead of relying purely on realistic gore, one turns the action into something almost surreal. Characters move through rooms like pieces on a nightmare chessboard while Madison attempts to understand what is happening to her. The final revelation transforms the entire film. Suddenly, earlier scenes take on a different meaning, and the strange clues scattered throughout the story begin making sense. Malignant is not necessarily scary in the traditional sense. It is strange, excessive, and deliberately theatrical. Its biggest achievement is that it commits completely to its wild premise. And that is why it remains memorable. You may forget dozens of conventional horror movies. But it is much harder to forget a film that begins as one genre and ends as something you never expected. Crimes of the Future, 2022. David Cronenberg has spent decades exploring the relationship between humanity, technology, and the body, and Crimes of the Future takes those ideas into one of his strangest worlds. In this future, human evolution has changed. People experience pain differently. Bodies develop new organs. Surgery has become performance art. Viggo Mortensen plays Saul Tenser, an artist who performs surgeries on his own body in front of audiences. The body itself has become entertainment. Tenser works with Caprice, played by Léa Seydoux, who performs the procedures and displays the results to fascinated crowds. But beneath the strange performances is a political struggle over the future of humanity. A government organization wants to control the emergence of new organs and new biological changes. Others believe humanity should embrace evolution rather than fight it. The film deliberately blurs the line between medical procedure and art. Cronenberg's imagery can be extremely uncomfortable, particularly for viewers sensitive to surgery, bodily transformation, and organic horror. But the movie is not simply trying to disgust you. It asks what happens when the human body becomes obsolete. If our bodies evolve beyond their current form, should we resist? Or should we celebrate the transformation? The characters live in a world where surgery is almost casual. People gather to watch operations as if attending concerts. That idea creates a strange mixture of horror and beauty. The film's title suggests that the future may be a crime against everything humanity currently considers normal. The characters don't necessarily agree on what evolution means. Some fear it, some worship it, some want to control it, and some simply want to profit from it. Cronenberg uses body horror to explore technological anxiety, artistic obsession, and the human desire to control our own evolution. The result is deliberately strange. It isn't designed to deliver conventional scares. Instead, it creates a world that feels almost familiar but fundamentally wrong. And that may be the most disturbing part. The film suggests that the future may not arrive as one dramatic event. It may happen gradually inside our bodies, until one day we realize we have become something we no longer recognize. Infinity Pool, 2023. What if you could commit a terrible crime and then simply watch another version of yourself take the punishment? That is the disturbing question at the center of Brandon Cronenberg's Infinity Pool. Alexander Skarsgård plays James Foster, a struggling writer vacationing at an exclusive resort with his wealthy wife Em. Their trip seems luxurious and peaceful until James accidentally becomes involved in a fatal incident. The consequences should be permanent. But the resort offers another option. For an enormous price, James can have a genetically identical copy created to face the legal punishment instead. Suddenly, death itself becomes something the wealthy can outsource. James is introduced to a group of tourists who have discovered this horrifying system. They live without the fear that normally controls human behavior. They can commit crimes. They can experience violence. They can behave recklessly. Because another version of them can pay the price. The concept allows the movie to explore what happens when consequences disappear. James becomes increasingly fascinated by this group and begins losing his sense of identity. The resort becomes a place where morality is blurred and people experiment with versions of themselves they would never reveal at home. The film becomes increasingly surreal as James's relationship with his own identity begins collapsing. Who is the real James? Does a copy have the same consciousness? If another version of you dies, should you feel anything? And if you know that your actions will never permanently hurt you, what kind of person do you become? The movie is filled with disturbing imagery, psychological horror, and surreal transformations. Cronenberg doesn't simply want to shock the viewer. He wants to create the feeling of watching a human being lose his connection to reality. The wealthy tourists become particularly disturbing because they treat horror like entertainment. They have escaped the normal rules of society, and they don't want to go back. James slowly realizes that the freedom he thought he wanted may actually be another kind of prison. Infinity Pool is controversial because of its explicit violence, sexuality, and disturbing imagery, but its deepest horror comes from privilege. What happens when people become so wealthy that consequences stop applying to them? The movie's answer is terrifying. Without consequences, humanity doesn't necessarily become free. It may simply become monstrous. Max China, 2024. Maxine Minx survived the nightmare of X, but survival isn't enough for her. She wants something bigger. She wants Hollywood. Set in 1980s Los Angeles, Max China follows Maxine as she attempts to transform herself from an adult film performer into a legitimate movie star while a mysterious killer begins targeting young women across the city. Mia Goth returns once again, but Maxine has changed. She isn't the frightened young woman we saw earlier. She is hardened, determined, and completely focused on becoming famous. She refuses to apologize for her past, even though the entertainment industry continues to judge people by the secrets they try to hide. The film surrounds Maxine with a world of neon lights, horror movies, ambitious filmmakers, private detectives, and dangerous people. Hollywood becomes almost another character. Everyone wants something. Everyone has a secret. And everyone seems willing to use someone else to get what they want. One of the film's most interesting elements is its relationship with the horror industry itself. Maxine is auditioning for a horror movie while a real killer is operating in Los Angeles. Fiction and reality begin to overlap, creating a strange atmosphere in which the movie industry is constantly feeding on real fear. Unlike Pearl, which is intensely psychological, Max China expands outward. It becomes a crime thriller, slasher, and Hollywood mystery. The violence is considerably more graphic, with bloody murders and disturbing imagery used to create an intentionally excessive atmosphere. The movie knows audiences are expecting something outrageous after X and Pearl, and it responds by turning the dial even further. But underneath the gore is a familiar theme. Maxine refuses to let her past define her. She believes fame will finally prove that she was right to survive everything she survived. The deeper she goes into Hollywood, however, the more dangerous the environment becomes. The killer seems connected to something much larger, and Maxine's past begins catching up with her. Suddenly, becoming famous isn't simply about getting a role. It's about staying alive long enough to claim the future she believes belongs to her. The trilogy ultimately becomes a story about identity. Pearl wanted fame but never escaped her isolation. Maxine escapes violence but carries her trauma with her. By Max China, she has transformed herself into someone who believes fear is something she can control. And that confidence is exactly what makes the final confrontation so satisfying. Maxine isn't waiting to be rescued. She is fighting for the identity she created. The trilogy ends as a celebration of survival, ambition, and the complicated price of becoming a star. Pearl, 2022. Before Maxine became a survivor, there was Pearl. And if X showed the consequences of Pearl's loneliness, Pearl takes us directly inside her mind. Mia Goth returns in one of the most intense performances of her career, playing a young woman trapped on an isolated farm in 1918 who dreams of escaping her miserable life and becoming a star. Pearl lives with her authoritarian mother and her disabled father. Her husband is away fighting in the First World War, and every day feels almost identical to the one before it. The outside world seems glamorous, colorful, and full of possibilities, while Pearl's reality is suffocating. She wants to dance. She wants to perform. She wants people to see her. Most importantly, she wants to escape. But Pearl's dreams are not simply ambitious. They become obsessive. T. West and Mia Goth transform the character into something fascinating because Pearl is simultaneously sympathetic and horrifying. You understand why she feels trapped, yet you slowly realize that her desire to escape is connected to something much darker. She doesn't simply want a better life. She wants recognition at any cost. Visually, Pearl is radically different from X. The bright colors, old-fashioned costumes, and almost fairy tale atmosphere make the movie look cheerful. But beneath that colorful surface is a psychological horror story about isolation and resentment. The contrast makes the violence even more disturbing because the movie looks like a vintage musical while behaving like a nightmare. Pearl's relationship with her mother becomes increasingly explosive. Her mother sees her daughter's dreams as foolish and dangerous, while Pearl sees her mother as the person preventing her from becoming who she believes she was meant to be. Their arguments become increasingly cruel, and the tension eventually reaches a point where there is no going back. Then comes the audition. Pearl sees it as her opportunity to escape, but the rejection destroys something inside her. The moment is devastating because it represents more than losing a role. It confirms her deepest fear: perhaps the world doesn't want her. Mia Goth's performance becomes extraordinary during the final stretch. Her emotional breakdown isn't presented as a simple horror movie scream. Instead, the camera stays with her. We watch her smile, cry, laugh, and unravel. The famous extended closing expression becomes unforgettable because the movie forces us to remain in Pearl's emotional space rather than cutting away. The film ultimately becomes a tragedy about a woman whose dreams are bigger than her ability to control herself. Pearl wants to be loved, admired, and remembered. Instead, she creates a legacy of violence. And when viewed alongside X, the two films become much more powerful. X asks what happens when youth confronts old age. Pearl asks what happens when a dream becomes an obsession. Together, they create one of modern horror's strangest character portraits. X 2022. A group of young filmmakers travel deep into rural Texas with a simple ambition: make a movie that could change their lives. But the location they choose hides a secret that turns their production into a nightmare. T. West's X looks at first like a classic slasher, but underneath its blood-soaked exterior is a surprisingly thoughtful story about youth, aging, desire, ambition, and the terrifying fear of becoming irrelevant. The film follows a small crew led by aspiring actress Maxine, played by Mia Goth, and her boyfriend Wayne, who believes they can make serious money by producing an adult film. They rent a farmhouse from an elderly couple, Howard and Pearl, expecting privacy and a cheap place to shoot. Instead, they discover that their elderly hosts are watching them far more closely than they realize. What makes X interesting is how deliberately it plays with expectations. The young characters represent everything Pearl once was, or desperately wishes she could still be. Maxine is ambitious, attractive, and determined to become a star. Pearl, meanwhile, is trapped in an aging body and a life she believes has passed her by. The contrast creates something much more uncomfortable than a standard killer versus victim setup. The violence gradually becomes more extreme, but the movie's greatest weapon is anticipation. West understands that sometimes what you imagine happening is more disturbing than what you actually see. The isolated farmhouse, the empty roads, the dark woods, and the unsettling presence of Pearl create a constant feeling that something terrible is waiting just outside the frame. Mia Goth gives the film its emotional center by essentially playing two very different characters. Maxine is fearless and ambitious, while Pearl is bitter, lonely, and increasingly unstable. Their connection gives the story an almost tragic quality. Pearl doesn't simply hate the young people around her. She envies them. She sees in Maxine a version of herself that she believes disappeared decades ago. The movie also deliberately mixes exploitation cinema with classic horror filmmaking. It knows exactly what kind of movie it resembles, but it refuses to remain a simple throwback. Instead, it uses the conventions of the slasher genre to explore uncomfortable questions about sexuality, aging, and the entertainment industry. And when the violence finally arrives, X doesn't hold back. Its practical effects, sudden deaths, and unsettling imagery create several sequences designed to make audiences physically uncomfortable. Yet the movie remains surprisingly controlled. It doesn't rely entirely on gore. The real horror comes from watching characters walk deeper and deeper into a situation they don't understand. The result is a film that feels both familiar and fresh. It is a slasher movie, an exploitation homage, and a character study wrapped into one. And perhaps its most disturbing idea is that the monster isn't simply someone hiding in the darkness. Sometimes the monster is the fear of growing old while watching somebody else live the life you believe you lost. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974. Few horror titles are as famous as the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and yet the movie itself is often misunderstood. Many people remember it as an explosion of gore. In reality, director Tobe Hooper created something much more psychologically brutal. The story follows a group of young people traveling through rural Texas. They eventually encounter a family living in an isolated house. And that family is not normal. The most famous member is Leatherface, a masked killer carrying a chainsaw. But the real horror comes from the entire family. The movie creates an atmosphere of heat, exhaustion, and helplessness. The characters are isolated, surrounded by an environment they don't understand. The production's low budget actually became one of its strengths. The rough visual texture makes the film feel disturbingly real. Interestingly, the movie was notorious for its violence despite using much less visible gore than many modern horror films. Hooper understood that suggestion could be more powerful than explicit imagery. The dinner sequence is a perfect example. The characters are trapped at a table surrounded by people behaving as if the situation is completely normal. The horror becomes almost surreal. Leatherface himself is also an unusual villain. The mask hides his identity, while his movements and reactions sometimes resemble those of a frightened child rather than a sophisticated killer. That makes him unpredictable. The film became controversial around the world and was banned or restricted in various countries. Its reputation became so extreme that some audiences believed they were watching something closer to real footage than a fictional movie. That myth only strengthened the film's impact. But beneath the shock is a story about isolation, industrialization, and a family that has become completely disconnected from normal society. The movie's final moments are particularly memorable because survival does not feel like victory. It feels like escape from hell. And the famous image of Leatherface dancing with his chainsaw remains one of horror cinema's most unforgettable endings. More than 50 years later, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre still works because it doesn't give the audience a comfortable distance from the nightmare. It puts you there. And once you're there, the only question is whether you can get out. These 15 movies prove that controversial cinema is not simply about showing something shocking. The strongest films use extreme images to explore deeper fears: aging, identity, violence, power, grief, desire, privilege, and the darkness hidden beneath ordinary life. Some of these movies became controversial because they crossed boundaries. Others became classics because they challenged audiences to think differently. But they all share one quality: they refuse to be easily forgotten. Long after the final scene disappears and the credits roll, their images, questions, and ideas remain. That is the strange power of extreme cinema. Sometimes the movies we most want to look away from are exactly the movies we remember the longest.